If you would, please turn your Bibles open to Deuteronomy chapter 8. Deuteronomy chapter 8, that's where we're going to be in just a moment. The book of Deuteronomy takes place right outside of the right outside of the Promised Land, a place where the Israelites have been 38 years prior. And this time, it's the second generation. And the second generation, since that 38 years, has seen person after person after person die. And now finally, they're about to enter in, and there's going to be one more death that's going to take place. Maybe the weightiest death of them all, a death in Moses. And the book of Deuteronomy is a series of speeches, a series of sermons from Moses before he dies to this second generation. And I think there's a lot of value we can learn from the book as a whole, but especially chapter 8. See, chapter 8, it deals with the wilderness, something that in the Bible is synonymous with our trials in life. And I've heard it said before, you're either going into a trial or you just got out of one. And so there's many lessons we can learn from God's perspective, from Moses' perspective on what the wilderness means in our life. And so that's what I'd like to do this morning. Look at this passage. And so let's start in Deuteronomy 8. We'll be reading verses 1 through 5. Deuteronomy 8, verses 1 through 5. The whole commandment that I command you today, you shall be careful to do, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land that the Lord swore to give to your fathers. And you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. And he humbled you and let you hunger and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Your clothing did not wear out on you, or your feet did not swell for these 40 years. Know then in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, the Lord your God disciplines you. Sometimes it's hard to believe that the trials that we face in life have meaning or purpose. That you face something in your life and you've thought, why am I going through this? Why has God put this in my life? Why am I suffering like this? Why has God taken this out of my life? Those are hard questions. And this passage doesn't give a complete answer, but it does give us a good answer to why those trials happen, why the wilderness does occur. Because the wilderness does have purpose. Your trials do have purpose. And the first one that we see is here in verse 2. He humbled you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. It's a lot easier to do the right thing when things are going well. It's a lot easier to make the right decisions, to be obedient to God when things are going good in your life. It's a lot harder when things aren't going good. It's a lot harder when trials are all around you, when it literally feels like you're in a wilderness. I want you to imagine that I had a mason jar in my hands. And let's put it right here. And then I dumped sand into the mason jar. And then I took this water bottle and I filled the rest of the mason jar up. And then I put the lid and we just sat for a little bit. And you would see all the sand would go to the bottom and the water eventually would look pretty clear. It looked pretty clear. It looked good. But if I took this mason jar and I shook it up, then that mason jar is going to be muggy. It's going to be blurry. It's going to be hard to see through. It will no longer be pure. And it's not the fact that that water beforehand was so pure in the first place. It just appeared that way. But what really showed what was in that jar was when you shook it up. See, I've heard it said before that trials do not make a man, but trials do reveal a man. That trials will show what is really there in your heart. Because sometimes we think of obedience as something that we know. And I don't think that's wrong in itself, but I don't think it stops there. Obedience is not just something that you know and then you do, but it's something that is on your heart. If you just go a page over to Deuteronomy 6, there's something called the Shema. The Shema is this prayer that the Jews would say multiple times a day. We've sung it and you probably know it, but let me just read it to you. Starting in verse 4, it says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. All these words that I command to you today shall be on your heart." The commandments of the Lord should be on our hearts. They should change who we are. They shouldn't just be something outside of us, but also inside of us. And what shows us what's inside of us is the trials. And so that is one of the purposes for the wilderness. One of the purposes is to test what is truly in your heart, to see what is actually there. Are you going to be obedient when times are tough? Are you going to be obedient when everything's not going like you want it to? Another purpose for the wilderness is it makes you know where life comes from. If you go back to chapter 8, look at verse 3. It says, "He humbled you and let you hunger and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord." The wilderness is a place of death. Nothing survives in the wilderness. Even when we see in Exodus 16:3, they say, "Why have you brought us out here? Is it to die? We could have died in Egypt." The wilderness is this place of death, but yet they live there. They lived there for 40 years. How do you live somewhere that is described as death for 40 years? The only way that that is made possible is because of the Lord. See, this passage tells us that manna was the way that they lived. And I want you to imagine being an Israelite, where you go out of your tent, and it's the first day manna's ever arrived, and it's kind of this like honey crust frost glaze that they gather together, and they take up this frost, and they put it in their tent, and they eat it for the day. I want you to imagine being that person. What do you think? Well, I have to go get more, because if I don't get more, then it won't be there tomorrow, and I can't control this, and so it's kind of scary to me, and so I'm going to get as much manna as I can, and then you wake up the next morning, and all your manna is rotten. How many times would it take you to trust in the Lord? How many times of exiting your tent every day, and you see, oh, the manna's there again? And then the next day, oh, the manna's there again. And the next day, the manna's there again. How many times would it take you to trust that the Lord is going to provide for you in the wilderness? One of the lessons of the wilderness is He humbles you to know that you are not God. That it's not because of your preparation, it's not because of your ingenuity that you have that manna and that you are surviving in this place of death. It is because of the Lord alone. And if at any time the Lord didn't tell for that manna to go, for you to be provided for, you would not have survived that place. The manna didn't keep you alive, but it was the Lord who sent the manna every day that kept you alive. And you see in verse 5, it says, "Know then in your heart, as a man disciplines his son, the Lord your God disciplines you." And I don't think we necessarily have a complete picture of what discipline means. When you think of discipline, you often think of punishment. And that's a part of discipline for sure, but it's not the totality of what discipline is. See, in its totality, what discipline is, what its purpose is to teach you and to instruct you. The Lord gives you wilderness periods. The Lord gave them a wilderness period to discipline them, to instruct them, to teach them a lesson. And we see later on in verse 16, at the end of verse 16, it says, "To do good to you in the end." In the end, the wilderness will be good for you. There is lessons that you need to learn at this time in your life. It helps you to see the reality of what was always there. That without God, you are dead, and with Him, you are alive, because He is your life. He is the source of life. And so we need to be fully reliant on God, because God will provide. You may be seeing this passage before, this verse particularly, in verse 3. It's the verse that Jesus quotes in his wilderness. The Israelites, they wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Jesus wanders in the wilderness for 40 days. And when he's in the wilderness, he is tempted, just like the Israelites are, but instead, he gets through the wilderness successfully. He doesn't fall to temptation. He is a truer and better Israel. So when the devil comes to him in the wilderness and he says, "Why can't you make these stones into bread? You could eat right here, right now." He uses this verse. And it's not only the aspect of that the spiritual is over the physical and he just needs the words of God and he doesn't need the bread. Jesus understands the lesson of this passage. I don't need to make my own bread. God will provide. Do you understand that? You don't need to make your own bread in the wilderness. God will provide. You don't need to gather extra in the wilderness. God will provide. God will provide for you in the wilderness. That is the lesson. Take it away. Do not go through a wilderness period. Do not go through a trial and not see this. That God makes you know where life comes from. Life comes from Him and Him alone. But not only this, the wilderness will end. The wilderness has purpose, but the wilderness will also end. Let's look here in verse 6, and I'll be reading through verse 9. "So you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God by walking in His ways and by fearing Him. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and springs, flowing out in the valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey, a land in which you will eat bread without scarcity, in which you will lack nothing, a land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills you can dig copper." There's seasons in life. Ecclesiastes 3 talks about this. That sometimes there's going to be a season of laughing, and sometimes there's going to be a season of mourning. Sometimes there will be a wilderness season, and sometimes there will be a season of Eden. This is how our life goes. But we need to remember when we are in the midst of our wilderness, when it feels like that trial is never going to end, and it's going to keep going, and we don't know when it'll ever end, we need to understand this. The wilderness will come to an end. Our trials are temporary. And that God has the power to take us from somewhere like a wilderness to somewhere like the promised land. I want you to notice how this promised land is described. In verse 7, "Of brooks of water, of fountains and springs flowing out in the valleys of hills." And later on it says in verse 9, "A land in which you will eat bread without scarcity, in which you will lack nothing." What do you think they wanted most in the wilderness? When it was blazing hot, let's say it's 105 degrees. And you're in the wilderness day after day after day, and you just have your tarp tent, and you're trying to protect yourself from the sun, and you have to walk miles at a time. What happens when you run out of water? When you haven't had water for a day in conditions like that? What are you craving most in that moment? Water. And you know it'd be great if I didn't have to stress about that water again. If this would just be a consistency in my life. That is what they desire. That is what they want. They want this consistency of blessing. But the thing is, they failed. They failed time and time again because they didn't trust that the Lord would take them into the promised land. They didn't trust that the Lord would provide for them in the wilderness because they could only see what was immediately around them. See, Israel fails in the wilderness because their hope is in what they see, not in an unseen God. They see in front of them they don't have water, and so they're stressed about water, and they complain about water. They see in front of them that they don't have food, and so they complain about food, how they don't have food. They get to the edge of the promised land before this, and they say, God won't give us the victory. because they are bigger than we are. They say, "You've brought us out here to die." They only see what is immediately around them. They do not look towards the future. They do not trust in God's promises of what He has told them. Do you trust in God's promises? Do you trust that the wilderness will come to an end? Because you don't want to give up on a goal because of a momentary affliction. That because I'm feeling the weight of this trial, which it is hard, I am feeling the weight of this trial and I am overwhelmed by it, I can't do this anymore. I can't do this anymore, and so I'm going to give up on the Lord. Do you understand that you will be sustained through this trial? God will provide for you like He always does and always will. See, one of the reasons this happens is that the goodness of God's gifts is best known after scarcity. You know how much better a cup of water is after a long, long hike? I remember one of my favorite meals. This is a disgusting meal. I know that before I say it. We went on this canoe trip, and we canoed miles and miles and miles. I think it was like 10 plus miles. I don't know. Maybe you canoe all the time, and you're like, that's nothing. I got back on the land, and they made macaroni and cheese mixed with tuna. And that was the most delicious meal I ever had in my entire life, because I was craving and starving just food. That would not be good at a normal place. I wouldn't have enjoyed it how I enjoyed it then, because I wasn't hungry. But when I am hungry, when I do want, it is so good. The blessings of God are so good. The basic things, just as food and water, are so good to me because I understand that they're from God. I understand that I need them, and they're provided for. But you might be in the audience, and you might be thinking, well, Dylan, there are some things that just don't go away. There are some trials, there are some hard things in life that do not go away. There are some sicknesses that end in death. There are some decisions that you make that will affect the rest of your life. That's true. But we have a promise from God that one day everything will be reversed. That all the wildernesses will be turned into promised land if you are a Christian. See, in the overall structure, the overall narrative of the biblical story, is that when we are in sin, we are in Egypt. We have this Pharaoh, we have Satan over us, and he's giving us heavy burdens. And God sends us a deliverer, a Moses-like prophet in Jesus, and he delivers us from that place. And we cross through a Red Sea, through baptism, and now we are going to be in the wilderness. And the wilderness in this overall structure is just our lives. That this whole life is a temptation and a struggle and a trial. But there will be a day where we enter into the true promised land. Where we enter into the true place, the true Eden of heaven. That yes, so some things, most things go in ebbs and flows. There's going to be wildernesses that are hard and then they go away. And there's something else that's hard and then it goes away. There's seasons. But there's some things that are just difficult and hard and challenging the rest of your life. But what we have as Christians is a guarantee. We have a guarantee that there's going to be this great reversal, this greater promised land of heaven. Do you trust that the wilderness will end? If not in this life, in the next. Don't forget the wilderness. Let's read verses 10 through 21. And you shall eat and be full, and you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land He has given you. Take care lest you forget the Lord your God by not keeping His commandments and His rules and His statutes which I command you today. Lest when you have eaten and are full and have built good houses and live in them, and when your herds and flocks multiply and your silver and gold is multiplied and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart be lifted up and you forget the Lord your God,
who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, who led you through the great and terrifying wilderness with its fiery serpents and scorpions and thirsty ground, where there was no water. Who brought you water out of the flinty rock? Who fed you the wilderness with manna that your fathers did not know, that he might humble you and test you to do you good in the end? Beware, lest you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gotten me this wealth. You shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the power to get wealth, that he may confirm his covenant that he swore to your fathers as it is this day. And if you forget the Lord your God and go after other gods and serve them and worship them, I solemnly warn you today that you shall surely perish. Like the nations that the Lord makes perish before you, so shall you perish, because you would not obey the voice of the Lord your God. Look at verse 10. And you shall eat and be full, and you shall bless the Lord your God for the land that he has given you. The Jews actually took this verse, and the Dead Sea Scrolls tell us that there was this Jewish practice going back to the late Second Temple period, where they would go and actually after they would be done eating, then they would pray. They would pray after they were full. And isn't this a struggle? Isn't this a problem? Where I'm in my wilderness, I'm in my trial, and things are hard, and so I'm going to do the Christian thing, and I'm going to lean on the people around me, and I'm going to get really involved in church, and I'm going to make sure I'm reading my Bible, and I'm going to be really, really good about my prayer life. But then when God takes you out of that place, you forget. You forget because you're full. You no longer go to him in prayer. You no longer lean on your spiritual family. You no longer take that time dedicated like you were in your wilderness, like you were in that trial. See, the thing is, prosperity is as just much of a test as suffering is. How many people do you know in your life, once they got things like money, once they got things like talent, once they got things like beauty, their lives were completely ruined? Prosperity is a test, and it's a test we oftentimes fail. Look at just overall. Let's take the world view. Where is Christianity thriving right now? Africa and Asia. Why do you think that is? Why do you think Christianity is thriving and growing rapidly in those places? Where there's more persecution, where there's more suffering, where there's more government over that. Not in a place here, like America, the land of the free, where we can gather here and worship openly. It's because their lives are wildernesses. Their lives are trials, and they understand the lesson from the wilderness just by life. That I need to fully lean on something outside of me. That I am not good enough where I'm at and what I'm doing, that I need something else, something better, that I need to be fully dependent on God. And that lesson's a lot easier for them to grasp and understand than it is for us. See, the thing is, arrogance stems from a lack of deep appreciation and recognition of God in our lives. Have you noticed that throughout this text? That it says, so he could humble you, so he could humble you, so he could humble you. And then it even culminates, we'll touch on it later on, where it says in our hearts we lift ourselves up. There's so much pride around this. There's so much pride around this story in how we are viewing ourselves. And we will get messed up if we do not remember the wilderness, if we do not humble ourselves, if we do not remember how the Lord has humbled us and how he has taken us to this place, and it was him alone. This is so much so the point of this passage that it's the chiastic or the chiastic structure of what is happening here.
It's what the point is being pointed towards. So let me explain to you what this is. So there's something called chiasms or chiasms, depending on who you are. I'm going to call them chiasms. So there's this chiasm, and what it is it takes the structure of the passage. It takes the thing and it narrows it down to a singular point that it's trying to make. And that point has the most emphasis. It's what the passage is supposed to be most about. And this was done so that they would understand and be able to remember passages better. See, things like chapters and verses in your Bible, they didn't come until about the 1500s. And so the way that they would remember Bible passages was things like this. And so notice how it comes down and down and down. And then this point in the middle, the point of the passage in the middle, the thing that has the most emphasis is prospering in the land and thanking God, and the danger of forgetting God in the prosperity. Moses says, guys, this is what you need to know. When God takes you from this place where we're at the foot of the promised land and we go into the promised land. When we finally get there, do not forget the wilderness. Do not forget all the lessons you've been learning this past 38 years since you were at the exact same place. Do not forget this place. Do not forget what God has done for you. Do not forget the wilderness. I like how it's said here. When we feel God has blessed us, that is the very time to seek Him as we never have before and praise Him for His faithfulness. When God has taken you out of that place, when God has taken you from that wilderness, praise Him and seek Him. Not less, but so much more so than you were prior. Have that full dependence, both in and out of the season. Do not forget that it was the Lord. I want to show you this. In Deuteronomy, the book as a whole, there's this repeated phrase that happens throughout it. You shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, then take care lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You shall remember what the Lord your God did to Pharaoh. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. You shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt. You shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt. You shall remember that you were in the land of Egypt. There's this repeated idea. I didn't even put all of them on here. There's more than this. This idea gets repeated that you guys will forget. Do not forget. Do not forget. Remember. Even in this passage itself, there's 5 times where this happens. You shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness. Take care lest you forget the Lord. Then your heart be lifted up and you forget the Lord your God. You shall remember the Lord your God, for it was He who gives you power to get wealth. And if you forget the Lord your God, don't forget. Moses just drives this point over and over and over again in the entire book and in this passage as a whole. We need to remember that we need the Lord and we need to depend on Him. We also need to remember that it was not us. It was not us who was so great. It was not our intelligence. It was not our resilience. It was not our ability to adapt. It was not our self-discipline or our determination to get through that hard thing. It was the Lord. It was not by my hand or my might or my power. It was not because of me that I made it through the wilderness. It was because of the Lord. And it was not because of anything else outside of me. In verse 19, it says, if you forget the Lord and go after other gods and serve them. If you contribute anything else in your life to getting you through that thing, if you contribute your reliance and your ability to go through that hard thing in that place of death to anything, even a good thing, but if it's not God, it's the wrong thing. Even if it's that person that means so much to you, even if it's your family, even if it's your significant other, even if it's your education or your wealth or your things or something like luck or timing. It was none of those things. It was the Lord. This is important for us to understand, for us to dwell on. These are the heavy words of a dying man. That the wilderness does have purpose.
That the wilderness is meant to test your heart to see what is there if you will obey in the hard time just as much as the good. To humble you to understand that you do need God and to fully depend on Him. The wilderness will end. Life goes in ebbs and flows, and you need to endure. Greater reversals will happen for all Christians. The wilderness of this life will come to an end. Do not forget the wilderness. Prosperity is a test within itself. Don't forget it was God. It was not you, and it was not anything else. Think how Jesus thinks in His wilderness. I don't need to make bread. God will provide. And so maybe you're here in the audience today, and you're going through a trial in your life. This lesson isn't supposed to say that's not hard, that's not difficult. Suck it up, you'll be okay. Instead, what this lesson is meant to do is to say that God will be there for you and with you in that place. And we would love to be a part of that journey with you. We would love to provide for you, to love you through that, to pray for you and with you. And if you haven't been delivered from that place of bondage, if you are in slavery in Egypt, if you haven't been taken from that place by the deliverer that we have in Jesus, that can happen here today. You can go through the Red Sea. You can go through the waters of baptism and be delivered. And one day, Lord willing, we can all be in heaven together, singing together in the presence of God. Whatever your need, please come forward as we sing and as we stand.